Deborah and Barak. We're well into the book of Judges now. We come to our very first major story about Deborah. I refer to the 12 tribes as independent of one another and often fighting one another, but they did have a few things in common. The major thing is that they had common history stories. Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and all the story of Joseph and all the stories about Moses and Joshua and conquering the land. They had that. They also had Shiloh and the tabernacle. That was a location. That's where the tabernacle was located, and they were supposed to go there every year, actually several times a year. But they also had the law. Ignored it a lot, but it was still a thing that they had in common. The Judges. As we go through these Judges, these stories, I challenge you, keep up with remembering the names of the Judges. And see if at the end you can name all of the Judges of this book. So far, it should be pretty simple. Othniel was the first one. Ehud. Shamgar, we haven't dealt with him, and not much is said about him. He's actually a judge up in the Galilee area. As I say, not much is mentioned, but he's in the book of Judges, and he's in the Song of Deborah. So he was a well-respected man, Shamgar. And then finally, Deborah. So if you keep up on that, you should at the end be able to name all the judges of the book. Well, Deborah, she was a judge. She's the only woman judge, a major Bible character in the Bible. How did she arrive at this? Where did she come from? Well, when you see movies about Deborah or read books about her, they portray her as a young, beautiful woman of that day. Probably not. The villages around about often had what is called the wise old village woman. This is someone who has been around the block a few times. Someone that knew everybody and knew everything about everybody. They were also insightful. The type of woman that mystery novels are written about, that has kind of an insight. Deborah was probably one of those. In the time of David, we have the story about the wise woman of Abel. Same thing. This wise woman that everyone respected. People would come to her and she would sit and listen to their problems and she would pass judgment and they would agree ahead of time that they would follow what she said. And her reputation probably didn't go very far, but it probably covered several villages in that area. But then she calls for Barak. For whatever reason, Barak respected her, probably was helped by some of the advice that she gave. And he came down from the Galilee area, came down to where she was at, down in the Bethel area. He challenges him to pull together an army, agrees to go with him. Now, once the battle was over, and this great victory from this Canaanite king, well, her reputation as a judge was well established from that time on. Well, the battle. The Canaanite king was from Hatzor. If you remember that, we talked about that back in the book of Joshua. Hatzor was up north of the Sea of Galilee, and the former king was over all the other kings in the north and headed up the northern campaign against Joshua. Well, Joshua burnt that city. Huge, huge city. Burned it to the ground. But left it. And so the Canaanites came back in and rebuilt up part of it. And now this is 170 years later. And they are once again a powerhouse. And they are taking over, as before, all of the northern area, including the northern part of Israel. Now, Sisera was the main general, and he was from Hatzor, but he was assigned to go down to Megiddo, which was the city that protected the major trade passes down in the Jezreel Valley. So that's where he was located. Deborah had Barak go up to Mount Tabor, or often people say Mount Tabor. Mount Tabor is a major mountain in that area. It looks like the top of an umbrella, kind of that same shape. It just sticks right out. You just can't miss it. Between the two, Megiddo and Mount Tabor, you have the Kishon River. Now the Kishon River was most of the time no more than a creek. Slow moving, everything in that area was dry, and the slow moving river goes down to the Mediterranean. That's where the battle's going to happen. So Sisera comes up from Megiddo, Barak comes down from Mount Tabor, and they meet down in this area. Suddenly, well, actually, just to mention the fact that Sisera had the advantage because he had chariots. Those were the tanks of that day. He could just mow down thousands of Israelites without any problem at all. But suddenly a flash flood hits, and that slow moving river becomes a rage. And all that area is now soggy with water, and those chariot wheels get bogged down right in the mire and stop. Now, Sisera's army weren't used to fighting on foot like the Israel army was, and so they just ran in all different directions. God gave a great victory here. Well, Sisera, he's running away from the battle. Now, he had expected to get two things: spoil and women. Deborah's song makes that very, very clear. He expected spoil and women. He didn't have either. And he's heading back to Hatzor. He's running in that direction. He comes across a tent, and the woman is alone there, Jael, and he approaches the tent. Now, that violated all proper etiquette. He was not to do that. She was there alone. Her husband was out making some deals, and he knew that he wanted three things as he approached that tent. Number one, he wanted protection. And if he went into the women's section of that tent, then he knew that the men would not look there. He secondly wanted spoil. Easy to get. And he wanted a woman. All three right there. He approaches the tent. Now, Jael. Jael is a descendant. Her and her husband are a descendant of Jethro, the father-in-law of Moses. When they came into the land, when the descendants came into the land, Joshua gave them a inheritance down near Arad, which is in the Negev desert, which would suit them fine. For some reason, this man and his wife decide they're going to travel north. So they take their herds and everything, and they travel up the Jordan Valley, and they come up just south of the Sea of Galilee. They're trying to negotiate area for their goats and their sheep. He makes an alliance with whoever's in charge, which is, of course, the Canaanite king, but he's not there right then. And she's alone. Now, Deborah describes her as a tent woman. A tent woman, which is a Bedouin term, her job, among many others, is to break down the tent and to set it back up again. She knew how to use a mallet and a tent peg. So he moves towards her tent. She uses the advantage of martial arts here. One of the principles of martial arts is rather than push back, you pull in, throws them all off guard. She could have pushed back, fought him and told him to go away and push back, but instead, she pulls him in. She already knew he's going to get what he wants here. She has to do something. In her wisdom, she pulls it, come on into the tent. Now, as he approaches to go into the tent, both of them know something. What he knows is by going into that tent, he'll get the protection, the spoil, and the woman. What Jael knows, by him coming in the tent, he cannot leave that tent alive and her retain her reputation. He had to go out dead. Both of them knew different things as he walks into that tent. And sure enough, she wins. She knows how to use a mallet. She can nail her man to the floor. Well, this great victory put Deborah and Jael into storybooks around the campfire where people would tell these stories for years to come. These two women. Interesting, some of the ancient men used to say, well, we know that obviously God gave this victory to us because He used weak women. Well, nothing weak about these two women. Great saints of God, great heroes of the faith. Come back when we give you more insights on the story.